morning. Today we have a guest speaker, Jeff Talarigo. He is a novelist. His most recent book is In the Cemetery of the Orange Trees, which is a book about an American's journey and an American's experience in Palestine. We're going to talk today about a writer that Jeff has been very enthusiastic about. Whenever we've talked, he's always, often I say, have you read Alistair MacLeod? And I have finally now taken Jeff up and read this beautiful, beautiful story that we're going to talk about today. Jeff, tell me about how you got involved with Alistair MacLeod and what you see in his work that really excites you.
I started reading Alistair MacLeod probably about, 8-10 years ago. And I was thinking about this earlier. I don't remember how I found out about him. I think it was at the Coop bookstore in Harvard. And I was perusing the shelves, and I came upon this book called Island, which is a collection of stories. And I read the first story, which we're going to be talking about today, The Boat. And it floored me in its sense of tradition and the losing of traditions in cultures, but also the divergence of the family in this story is just remarkable. You have, the mother who is, pristine, and the father's room is just this mess. But there's these whole different diverging stories throughout within the household, not only the community in Nova Scotia, but also the household itself. And the thing that I love as a writer myself and as a reader is when a writer uses the setting as a character in the book. And I do that in my work as well. And a lot of the writers I really love do that as well. And I think, maybe other than people, the most important thing as far as something that molds us as human beings is where we grew up and the setting and the place, sense of place. So to me, and Alistair MacLeod does this elegantly as he weaves the setting throughout the family stories and the stories of the fishermen, and later in the book also he talks about the coal mining of that area. And I grew up in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and so it really just hit home. Like, oh, these were my people actually. So.
Yeah, The Boat. I mean, I love the idea that you say about tradition and the losing of tradition, and how that becomes a conflict in itself. How much of the tradition can you maintain, or do you really want to maintain, and at what cost? Tell me more about the setting as character in The Boat. That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah. And then also in that story, he's talking about, and this is a human thing throughout all people's lives, is being trapped. And whether it's being trapped by guilt or by sense of tradition or by place or whatever it may be. And all of these elements are brought into that story as well, that feeling of just being trapped as a human being. And guilt plays a big part in the narrator's story as well. So, and again, those things, myself, I left home after 36 hours after graduation and never went back really. And, but the place I grew up in, this coal mining town, totally shaped me, totally as a writer, as a person. And I think Alistair MacLeod brings that out so well in all his writing, is this, how it shaped him. He wrote this collection of stories, 16 stories. He wrote in 30 years time.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote it, and he was a college professor in Ottawa, and summers were his only time to write. So he wrote for 3 months every year. And he wrote these eloquent stories, pretty much one story every 2 years. And that's also what I love, how you can just see how he hones the craft, the stories, the craft. And I think anybody who reads him, a writer in particular, you can learn so much from just reading his stories. And that's why I teach him in my ESL classes, just teaching them the senses of, the setting and telling the story and the voice and all that, and he does that also well. So he's a wonderful writer to teach at any type of course. Again, I teach at ESL, you're teaching at university, but the elements are the same, and the students really love him. They've really attached themselves to his stories, which is wonderful. So.
How does that's fascinating to think about ESL students. It's been, I taught ESL
Yeah,
many, many years ago, and I certainly never
yeah.
got, I never had students who would have been able to make their way through a work as dense and lyrical and complex as this. How does this, how does your students respond to this highly sophisticated text?
What I do, Phil, I'll do this story maybe over 2 weeks' time,
Hmm.
and I walk them through it. We go through it page by page. We read aloud. The students read aloud. I read aloud, and we just walk. I walk them through it and how he uses white space and how he transitions. But mainly we're looking about the stories and how it connects. How's it connect to your life, a Chinese student or a Japanese student or a Brazilian. And it's any great literature does that, and they find those threads about and so then we write stories in the class about when they were a child, and stories within their family, and I'm getting some quite remarkable work from these students, and they're all high level. Not all of them love to read. I had one student yesterday actually just commented on a Zoom meeting, and he said, I'm really glad I took this class. It's a 3-month class. And he said, I never liked to read, but the first 2 books, he said, these are really interesting. And I said, well, maybe this will help you become a reader. And he said, yeah, maybe. And he said, he was just really excited about having to read literature, a little bit stubborn at first, but then he got into it. And I said, just let it wave over, relax you and all that. And he really started liking it. Those are the comments, a teacher loves, those things that are engaged. So I probably have 8 out of my 14 students that are really into it. 6 are, you sort of pull them along, but that's like any class. That doesn't have to be ESL. It could be any class where and I'm very happy with it. If I can engage 60% of my students in literature, I'm thrilled. That's a great number, so.
Jeff, you talk about the voice, and I have to say, one of the things I found really charming and sweet and also a little scary is the fact that this narrator, this boy, is moving between an adult perspective and then recording his perspective back then. And he'll revise himself and say, well, it didn't really happen like that. It didn't happen all at once. And then he goes back and, it makes you realize all the missing spaces, the things that he can't tell. Uh, that because he's limited in his perspective, but also feeling like he's limited in terms of how to address and arrange this huge amount of time, that he'll sometimes telescope. And I'm curious your take on
Yeah.
the creation of narrators, because your narrators are also, in a sense, oftentimes, in Cemetery of the Orange Trees, for instance. I mean, the American in your novel is in somewhat of the same situation. How do I address, in the case of the boat, it's maybe a huge amount of time. In the case of the American in Palestine, it's a matter of how do I address this incredible difference. Tell me, the place of the narrator in both your work and in the boat.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because my character, the American in the book about Gaza, Cemetery of the Orange Trees, is somewhat similar to the narrator in Alistair MacLeod's book. And I also had been growing up in this small coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and there were no minorities whatsoever. I mean, and I felt trapped as well. And I think that will come out in the Cemetery of the Orange Trees. And this narrator feels trapped as well. I was not really trapped by tradition. My father was a lawyer, so I didn't come from a coal mining family. But that feeling of being trapped within a town, and I wanted to get out. But then I thought of my family and my grandparents and the people I loved there, and so I thought of and the guilt, the guilt of leaving and all that. And this narrator hits that on the head. It's just this beautiful story of he wakes up at the beginning of the story and it's 20 years later, whatever it may be, but he thinks he hears people throwing pebbles at 4:30 in the morning off his window, and he has to go out and work in the fishing boats and stuff. But it's done, which MacLeod does so well, is through voice, just telling the story through voice. And my students were really struck also by what you just mentioned about that. Okay, it didn't happen this fast, of course. And just the matter-of-fact way he said that. And the students thought, okay. And I teach them that in their writing as well. You don't have to tell us everything. And stories change. I mean, stories change from generation to generation, and they're retold, and things are added, things are deleted. And but that's how, our lives are. Stories of my great-grandfather, I'm sure I'm retelling them probably 50% of the truth, and the other 50% is something, I threw in there maybe, or my grandmother threw in. But that's how stories evolve. But the heart of the story, the losing of the tradition, the sense of the guilt and the traditions of guilt, those continue, throughout all the stories. That's maybe the thread that sort of goes throughout all the family stories, in my family for sure. And, everybody has that story. So.
I think of the ending, which is just incredibly heartrending and yet so understated. I mean, just as I look back and my father was not there, and you're realizing, well, wait a minute, did I misread something here? And then, because he's just buried it in this picture of the storm, and that's the end. And he explains to himself and to the reader why there's no point in return, in going back. You can't ever rescue anyone under those circumstances. But when I think about the idea of sentimentality, something that writers fear and attempt not to cultivate in their own work, and I realize that to some extent, it's even more difficult when you're faced with an event which would be, as you point out, so mythologized in your own life. I mean, that moment of not being there, there would be string music, there would be all sorts of, you would move toward that dramatically, and yet MacLeod just kind of moves over it and makes you realize, as you point out, that about half of what you say, has to be lost to the sea. It has to be lost to the time, to the vagaries of the past. I guess I just found it to be even more moving because it was so unsentimental.
Well, that's what I think maybe another writer that you're going to be teaching in this course, Colin McCann, Irish writer. I was very lucky. We became friends 25 years ago in Japan. We met, and I had just started writing fiction. I just got back from Gaza, and he was reading some of my stories, 6 months into my writing. And I remember the one comment he wrote on it, big comment, was, "Don't gild the lily, Talarigo." And that's really the sentimentality of that. And that was a really important lesson. I learned that really early as a writer. And MacLeod is just so understated in the story. It's just like, and me, I think, yourself as well, a really great reader. And it grabbed me as well. I was like, wow. So I was wondering, how are my ESL students going to react to that? And I got, a couple, is he dead? What happened? And, they were just like, and then we started going back into the story and seeing different things. But yeah, that beautiful sentence, terrific.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Colin. We're going to be doing a long story of his, Everything in This Country Must. And of course, also, as you know, there's the film of that, which is incredibly heartrending and horrible. The film and the story about Northern Ireland. Tell us a little bit. That's a great subject to get into, not just with Colin, but we think of writing as emerging out of some solitary isolation. But you've given there two examples: one with a literary example of Alistair MacLeod, and another of a personal example of Colin McCann. How is writing a kind of collaborative experience for you, as well as an isolating experience?
Yeah, that's a great point. It really is. And I'm pretty much a recluse as far as, I love people, but boy, I really, really, really crave being alone. But this relationship with Colin, I was a journalist before, and I was sort of segueing into transitioning, if you will, into becoming a novelist, which is totally different. And Colin and I would just take walks, and we'd climb the mountain in Japan where we lived, and just talk literature. and we would talk writing. And, you know, again, at this point, I was starting out. Cullum's first book was going to be published like 3 months later. And then Cullum left. He went to New York. He left, and I was, you know, 8 months into my writing, starting out as a writer. And we stayed in touch a lot. And, you know, it took me 10 years of writing, but most of that was in solitude. It was really in solitude. And Cullum always said that, you know, my God, Jeff, you worked 10 years without really any feedback. I mean, you weren't in a writer's group per se and all this stuff. But Cullum would read my stuff, you know, every year or so. He would write me comments and notes, and that really kept me going. So, but then later, after I had my first book, I started teaching where you do at Wilkes University, and boy, the reason I stayed there mainly for 12 years is the community. I've never felt so connected to writing and literature as when with this community of writers, and you being amongst them. And every time I come back from a residency, I feel high, excited, creative. I want to get back to my book, and my passion's relit every year, you know, twice a year. And so that sense of community, I never really felt that until I joined a community like Wilkes University. And it's been a blessing, because I had some really difficult times with my third book getting it out after all those years. But then I had this support network, and it was huge. I mean, it was totally, people would just comment on what I was writing, but it was just that knowing that people really care, and that people genuinely like your work, and they're supportive of it. They're critical in a good way, as opposed to in a bad way, which makes you not want to write. You know, I had that happen earlier in my career. I was in a writer's group at first, and it got personal, and I stopped writing for like 3 months because this one woman was attacking my stuff, and it was personal. It wasn't a writing thing. And then that's why I stopped. That's why I started working alone. I said, you know, that wasn't motivating me anymore. It didn't have a purpose. But being able to critique a person's work without destroying them, and without, you know, keeping their passion alive. And Cullum's like that as well. Cullum's an incredible reader. I mean, just an incredible reader. And as are you and Bob Mooney. I mean, those three, I trust the eye. And so I was blessed to have meeting Cullum McCann at that time. And we're still friends. We got to know each other very well. Our families, we babysat each other's kids and all this stuff. So, but then, you know, as a writer, he taught me a lot of things, and the first thing we just talked about was that sentimentality. You know, don't gild the lily. Trust yourself as a writer. Trust yourself. Trust your voice. And it was great because we shared back in Japan. We read William Kennedy's Ironweed together. I remember that. And now, whatever, 15 years later, I meet William Kennedy at Wilkes University, and you know, I talked to him. And I walked into his hotel the one night, him and his wife arm in arm, and this is like, you know, beautiful stuff. But, you know, so we read these books together, and I was not a really great reader, but Cullum taught me a lot about reading, and reading as a writer as opposed to just reading. And so I'm very fortunate for that. And, you know, I'm not sure if every writer's had that person in their life. I think probably at one point somebody had somebody who really inspired him, and I was very fortunate very early on, you know, 6 months into writing fiction, to meet Cullum. So, and you're doing everything in the country. That's great.
Yeah, everything in this country must. It's of course set in Northern Ireland,
yeah.
And it's a very chilling and unsentimental story and film. You know, beautifully filmed. In fact, so you know. When we watched, I remember watching it here in our house in the basement. It was just my wife and I, Elsa, and she ran out. She said she knew something bad was going to happen. She just couldn't. I mean, the film literally drove her out of the room. It was that good, you know.
It was that good. Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, I've taught that film and that story in my ESL classes as well years ago.
Okay.
Same one. And it's a terrific, it's a really great story, and the film tie-in as well, which is, the film is 18 minutes.
Right. Yeah, it's very short. You know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Thank you so much, Jeff Talarico. We look forward to being able to meet once again in real life. But thanks for joining us on Zoom today. And best of luck with the ESL. And
my pleasure, Phil. It's always good to see you. Yeah.
All right.